and when I land back there, help me. Help my family. And something transformative happens in her life after this experience with the spies. Well, she gets brought back into the community of Israel. And she ends up marrying an Israelite man. You see, many, many years later, in the Gospel of Matthew, the very Jewish Gospel of Matthew, we find a name that is precariously placed in a genealogy that leads up to the lineage of the Messiah. All those, if you read the Bible enough and you got into those genealogical lists, whether in the book of Genesis or even in these books we've been studying, you get to the book of Matthew, you get it in the book of Luke. Most people are bored to tears with those things, but in them there's a lot of story. And you find a name precariously placed there. You can see it up on the screen. It's the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 4. It says, Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Somebody remind me real quickly. Who is Nahshon? We've learned this in service. He's the guy, he's the man of courage who jumped into the Red Sea that precipitates the full Red Sea parting. This is what we've been hearing his story over the course of the last year and a half. Nahshon, a man of courage, was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed who also was not a Jewish person. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. Rahab, the enemy Canaanite prostitute of the former life, is the great-great-grandma of the poet, warrior, king David. And what will end up later on being the ancient grandmother to Jesus Christ, the Messiah himself, 30 generations later. The father brings his Messiah son Jesus, a Jew, through a Canaanite prostitute. Don't ever tell another person that God cannot use them. Do not ever believe that is true for you either. What we do in our life matters. And there's consequence for what we do in our life. Don't get me wrong. God doesn't erase the past, but he can forgive it. He can write new futures. I love the story of Rahab. A life saved is a life transformed. Transformed to bless God and to bless the world being made by that transformation. What happens if she doesn't do this? What happens if she doesn't do this? What does that say about having lineage yourself that ends up leading to David, leading to the Messiah? What happens if just a simple, small act of belief, an act of faith, changes everything? Teresa Gondry and her family would end up being saved by British paratroopers and soldiers who had come into Benneville under cover of darkness and silence. Her information had led to the capture and the defense of this particular bridge on which her little cafe sat in Benneville, France. Two men, faces battle-painted in coal black, among a whole host of British troops who will end up there. They had landed in the village. They had taken out the substantial force of German troops, the rest having fled. And so they own the bridge. They, generally speaking, possess the town. And guess what they do? They knock on the door of the cafe. And they're down in the basement, and she says, "Go answer the door." They answer the door. Her husband knows English and French. She knows French and German. Her husband knows English, and they told the Gondrys that they were the very first people liberated in France. The very first, because this was the very first act of the Allies to take that bridge. You're the first ones. For a moment, there was only silence. They're stunned. And then Teresa begins to hug and kiss and embrace these English soldiers. She's laughing and crying all at the same time. Their coal black makeup is rubbing up against her face as she gives each and every one of these guys hugs and kisses and holds on to them. Almost can't even believe it. She would kiss every new arrival, also in black paint, her face being completely black by the end of the day. on June 6, 1944. She would refuse to wash her face for 2 to 3 days, historians tell us. After finding this out, she and her husband go out into their garden where 4 years before they had buried 98 bottles of champagne before the occupying force of Germany had come in. They dig it up and they pop every cork. They pour it into the glasses. They pour it over these troops. Finally, we are saved. Never again would a British troop from the 6th Airborne Battalion ever have to pay for a drink when they came into Benneville. The smallest of people understand big rescue. In the smallest acts of faith, God uses in big ways. How many of you would love a future that is filled with joy and story and honor and celebration where sadness, guilt, or humiliation had previously lived? Well, like Mrs. Gondry and like Rahab, our future is built into this, the revealing of the rescuer, the revealing of the Savior. It doesn't feel like any sacrifice to dig up all 98 bottles and pour them out in a celebration, to have your face changed up. Because finally my rescue's here. Finally. People like Rahab teach us a lot about the God who is written inside the pages of this Bible. I hope that you believe and that you will say, God, transform my life. And I pray that in doing that, I discover you. That my life begins day by day to be transformed into a genuineness that looks so much like your word, so much like the saints before me, and that in every possible way, I might be a part of the lifting of other people. Whatever you need from me, God, I'll give my 98 bottles of champagne. It's easy when I understand I have been rescued. In a moment, we're going to be experiencing communion together. This is not intended by God to be a religious act. It is intended to be a remembrance of what he has done. In many ways, it is much more like cracking open 98 bottles of champagne than the guilt that existed or the humiliations that existed before. It's a celebration. It's a memory. God, you've done that. Thank you. For some of you today, keep in mind that if you've gone through this as a religious act, but have never done it as a spiritual moment of saying, God, I believe that you came to the planet Earth to forgive me my sins. That's why you hung on that cross. You died in my place. Taking this is no magic. Believing the truth of it is that small kernel of truth that changes everything. If you come up for the very first time today saying, I understand now the God who has saved me, come up and receive this with joy. Maybe mention to myself or Pastor Bob when you come, you know what, this is the first time I take it because I believed. You are invited to come up and celebrate the fact that God has saved you. When you can make your way up to the middle aisle, follow the folks that are in front of you, come up, and if you would take the elements and hold on to them as you make your way back to your chair, we're going to take them together as a church family.